America has had a tradition of Thanksgiving dating all the way back to the Pilgrims. They had been in Holland, where they had annual days of Thanksgiving, saving them from the Spanish, the Iron Duke, who destroyed Antwerp and several cities, and then the Spanish Armada was sunk. So the Dutch had a tradition, and the Jews that were chased out of Spain had gone to Holland, and they had an annual tradition of Thanksgiving, one of the Jewish holidays. The Pilgrims landed in America, and Squanto, the Indian who had been captured and sold as a slave in Spain and hitchhiked his way to England, was finally dropped off back in the Massachusetts area prior to the Pilgrims landing, and he was able to be an interpreter for the Pilgrims and put them on good terms. So the Indians brought their deer, and the English had their puddings, and then the first Thanksgiving went on for 3 days. One overlooked piece of history with the Pilgrims is they had to fight ISIS. In the year 1625, the Pilgrims had saved up 800 pounds of beaver skins and dried fish, and they sent them back to England for trade. And William Bradford writes in the history of the Plymouth settlement that the large ship towed behind the small ship, and they made it happily across the Atlantic and were in the English Channel. But there she was unhappily taken by a Turkish man of war, carried off to Morocco, where the captain and the crew were made slaves. Thus, all trade was dead, and the happy news they meant to bring home turned into heavy tidings. So here, this struggling little pilgrim colony, how long it would take them to save up 800 pounds of beaver skins to have Muslim pirates, the ISIS state. And the Muslims, a couple of years later, captured an entire Irish village, the stolen village of Baltimore, Ireland. Rounded them up, took them to Morocco. Around 1637, they captured 400 from Reykjavik, Iceland. Rounded them up, took them to Morocco, sold them into slavery. And so we often forget that the cute little pilgrim pictures of them having turkey, that they had faced the same ISIS Muslim threat that is being faced today. There were three types of colonies. There were company colonies, royal colonies, and proprietary colonies. Proprietary means that the whole colony was given as property to a William Penn or a Lord Baltimore for Maryland or the 7 Lord Proprietors for the Carolinas. But Virginia was a company colony. During Catholic Europe, the sin of usury was you could not pay or receive interest, but when the Reformation happened, Holland started what was considered the first company, the Dutch East India Company, where a baker, blacksmith, doctor could invest money in a ship going to Indonesia. When it came back, you would get some interest, some profit. And when they settled New Amsterdam, they had the New Amsterdam Stock Exchange, and then the British took it over. Well, Virginia was a company colony, and the company bylaws said everything would be held in common for 7 years, and everyone would be paid out of ye common stock, and all the cattle and land and houses would be owned in ye common stock, and at the end of 7 years, it would be divided up equally amongst the planters and adventurers, the investors, and nobody wanted to work. Half of them died the first winter. They were like coming up with excuses, and William Bradford said, we're going to have another shortage because nobody's planting. And so he scraps it and says, look, everyone gets your own plot of land. And he said that this was a failure of this communistic system. And so the Pilgrims went from communism, a communistic system, to the private ownership of land, and they all got out there. The ladies put the babies on their hip and went out and planted, and the next year they had a very big harvest. And so I think that's one of the things that's overlooked that the Pilgrims had done, that they espoused capitalism. Franklin Roosevelt realized the day after Thanksgiving was a great shopping day, and during the Great Depression, he thought if he could move Thanksgiving a week earlier, it would have another week of shopping and kickstart the economy. It didn't work. It actually became a campaign issue in 1941, and some states had been Republican, and they wanted to keep the fourth Thursday, and some were Democrat, and they kept the third Thursday, and some kept both, and it was quite confusing. And FDR finally gave up on the week earlier, so moved it back to the original last Thursday of the month. We do know that around the third year, they actually issued a proclamation. But it had been a tradition where when things were bad, they would have days of prayer. When things were real bad, they would have days of fasting and prayer. And when things turned around, they would have days of thanksgiving. And so the Pilgrims had this tradition. It filtered through the years. Many states and colonies had days of Thanksgiving. When the Revolutionary War started, the first national day of Thanksgiving after the Declaration was after the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. And then when we became a nation, the Congress had passed the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. And they asked George Washington to issue a day of Thanksgiving, which Washington did. They would have, again, days of prayer, days of fasting and prayer during a threatened war with France, during a cholera epidemic in 1849. When the British burned the White House, James Madison had a day of fasting and prayer. But then when things turned around, they'd have days of Thanksgiving. And Lincoln is the one who made the Day of Thanksgiving an annual event. And then it came all the way up to the present. We do have this tradition of Thanksgiving in America, and it is important for us to acknowledge that there is the God of our fathers that we are grateful to for this wonderful experiment of self-government.